What was the arms race?
The arms race refers to the buildup of nuclear weapons by the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. The race began on August 29, 1949, when the Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb. Prior to this, only the United States had the knowledge to build the atomic bomb.
What was the controversy about the Guantanamo detainees?
After the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. military began holding terror suspects at a detention center at the naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The U.S. Navy has occupied Guantanamo since the Spanish-American War. In 1898, paying an annual lease to Cuba. The White House labeled the detainees enemy combatants. The controversy came when they were not charged with any crimes, yet they continued to be held. The first detainees were transported to Guantanamo, or Camp Gitmo. In January 2002, after being captured in Afghanistan. But no charges were made against any detainees until more than 2 years later. In February 2004, American lawyers challenged the Bush administration policy at Guantanamo, saying that it was a violation of the Due Process Clause of the U.S. Constitution. In January 2005, one district court judge agreed with the prosecution, saying that the Constitution applied to the prisoners. They could not be deprived of their liberty without due process of the law. The Bush administration immediately moved to appeal the ruling. Some in the international community also strongly criticized the U.S. government for holding the suspects. One of Britain's most senior judges called the policy a monstrous failure of justice. In response to the widespread criticism, the U.S. Defense Department considered making major changes to the tribunals set up to prosecute terror suspects at Guantanamo. The changes were to bring the tribunals in line with the judicial standards of U.S. court-martials. But questions also arose about the treatment of the detainees and the methods used in interrogating them. Human rights groups made charges of abuses. In spring 2005, United Nations officials working in the area of war crimes were awaiting a visit to Guantanamo. The hold-up was that they requested full access to the facilities and the prison population, conditions Washington was reluctant to allow. According to a February 2005 American Forces Information Service report, there were about 545 people from some 40 countries being held at the Guantanamo Detention Center at that time. The government also held terror suspects, some of them senior members of the terrorist network Al-Qaeda. In Navy brigs in South Carolina, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and on Navy vessels at sea.
How did Joan of Arc become a warrior?
Joan of Arc, called the Maid of Orleans, c. 1412 to 1431, gained fame for leading the French into victory over the English in the battle for Orleans in 1429. A year before the battle, the English forces had invaded northern France and took possession of an area that included the city of Reims, where all of France's kings were crowned in the cathedral. Thus, Charles VII, 1403 to 1461, whom France recognized as their king, had never had a proper coronation. It is said that Joan, an extraordinarily devoted Catholic who was then just a teen, appealed to Charles to allow her to go into battle against the English who were besieging Orleans. Though he was skeptical of her at first, she claimed to have heard the voices of saints, he eventually conceded. In the battlefield, Joan also overcame the doubts of the French troops and their leaders, who were understandably hesitant to follow the young girl's lead. She proved to them that she was not only capable but also successful. In April 1429, in just 10 days' time, Joan led the French to victory over the English, who fled Orleans. Still determined to see Charles properly crowned, Joan proceeded to lead a military escort for the king into Reims, where he was at last coronated on July 17, 1429, with Joan of Arc standing beside him. Next she determined that Charles should authorize her to try to free Paris from English control. Again the king acquiesced, but this time with dire results. She was captured by the French Burgundians, English sympathizers and loyalists, who turned her over to the English. Believing she was a heretic, by all reports Joan of Arc was clairvoyant, the English burned her at the stake in Rouen, France, on May 30, 1431. She is still considered a national hero of France. Recognizing Joan of Arc for her unswerving faith and for having valiantly pursued what she believed her mission to be, the Catholic Church canonized Joan of Arc in 1920. The feast day of St. Joan of Arc is celebrated on May 30.
Did Newton invent calculus?
Yes, Newton did invent calculus. But so did German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz, 1646 to 1716, independently of Newton. Both men had developed calculus in the context of trying to explain the laws of physics. Newton's development of calculus predated that of Leibniz, but he failed to publish it. Leibniz published his results in 1684, Newton followed suit in 1693. Each used different symbols and notations, but Leibniz's were considered superior and were more widely adopted, causing friction between the men. Their conflict became a matter of national pride, with English scientists refusing to accept Leibniz's version. Nevertheless, since Newton's system predated that of Leibniz, he is credited as the originator.
What was radio's immediate cultural impact?
During the 1930s, radio, pioneered in the late 1800s, was woven into the fabric of everyday American life. People across the country in cities, suburbs, and on farms tuned in for news and entertainment, including broadcasts of baseball games and other sporting events as well as comedy and variety shows, dramas, and live music programs. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, used the new medium to speak directly to the American public during the trying times of the Great Depression, broadcasting his fireside chats from the White House. Between the 1920s and the 1950s, gathering around the radio in the evenings was as common to Americans as watching television is today. Networks offered advertisers national audiences, and corporate America eagerly seized the opportunity to speak directly to people in their own homes. The advent of television in the 1950s and its growing popularity over the next 2 decades changed the role of radio in American life. Having lost their audience to TV, radio programmers seized rock music as a way to reach a wide, albeit a very young, audience. Many argue that the rise of the musical genre kept radio alive. In the decades since, radio programming has become increasingly music-oriented. Talk and news programming are also popular.
What was the Berlin airlift?
It was the response during 1948 and 1949 to the Soviet blockade of West Berlin. After World War II, 1939–45, the German city had been divided into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. But following the conclusion of the war, it did not take long for the Cold War, 1947–89, between the Western powers and the Soviet Union to heat up. When the Americans, British, and French agreed to combine their 3 areas of Berlin into one economic entity, the Soviets responded by cutting the area off from all supply routes. In June 1948, all arteries, road, rail, and water into West Berlin were blocked by Soviet troops. Since Berlin was completely surrounded by the Soviet occupation zone, the Soviets clearly believed the blockade would be an effective move that would prompt the Western countries to pull out. But the move failed. The Americans, British, and French set up a massive airlift. For the next 11 months, West Berlin was supplied with food and fuel entirely by airplanes. The Soviets lifted the blockade in May 1949, and the airlift ended by September.
What alliances were forged during World War I?
In its declaration of war against Serbia in late July 1914, Austria-Hungary was joined in early August by its ally Germany, which together formed the Central Powers. In October 1914, Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. When the fighting began, France, Britain, and Russia threw their support behind Serbia, and together were known as the Allies. The Allies declared war on the Ottoman Empire in November 1914. After Turkish ships bombarded Russian ports on the Black Sea and Turkish troops invaded Russia. Eventually, 20 more nations joined the Allies, but not all of them sent troops to the front. Belgium, Montenegro, and Japan joined the Allies in August 1914. With Japan declaring war on Germany and invading several Pacific islands to drive out the Germans. In 1915 Italy and San Marino joined, as fighting wore on. In 1916, Romania and Portugal became Allied nations. And 1917 saw the entry of 8 countries. Most notably the United States and China, but also Liberia, Greece, Siam, Panama, Cuba, and Brazil. Before the war ended in 1918, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua all became supporters of the Allies.
What is the Homeric question?
During the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars became involved in a debate, referred to as the Homeric question, about whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by the same author, or even if any one author can be credited with the entire composition of either poem, and what kind of an author Homer was. The dispute continues today. Scholars believe the Iliad was probably written much earlier than the Odyssey, though there is not enough evidence to prove that the Greek poet Homer, c. 850-BC, did not write both epics. Further, it was suggested that Homer was a bard, oral poet, who was unable to read or write and who sang the great stories of the Iliad and Odyssey to the accompaniment of a lyre. According to this theory, the tales would have been dictated by Homer to a scribe late in the poet's life. However, some have left open the possibility that the human histories told in the Iliad and the Odyssey were in fact the composite result of the storytelling of numerous bards. Several other poems, including the Margits and the Batrachomyomachia, have also been attributed to Homer, but they were most likely written by his successors.
Why was Constantine I called the Great?
Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, c. 275 to 337, is credited with no less than beginning a new era in history. His father, Constantius, was ruler of the Roman Empire when he died in 306. Though Constantine was named emperor by Roman soldiers, a power struggle ensued. During a battle near Rome in 312, Constantine, who had always been sympathetic toward Christians, reportedly saw a vision of a flaming cross. He emerged from the conflict both converted and victorious. For the next 12 years, Constantine ruled the West Roman Empire while Licinius, also tolerant to Christians, ruled the East. But a struggle between the two emperors ended in death for Licinius and Beginning in 325, Constantine ruled as sole emperor. During Constantine's reign, Christians regained freedom of worship and the Christian Church became legal. In 325 he convened the Council of Nicaea, from whence came the Nicene Creed so familiar to Christians today. In moving the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, in 330, Constantine shifted the empire's focus from west to east and in so doing laid the foundation for the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern Orthodox Church regards Constantine as a saint.
Why did NATO respond to the 9/11 attacks?
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, responded to the terrorist attacks on the United States. Because its charter states that an attack on any member nation is considered an attack on the alliance. The language is contained in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, signed April 4, 1949, in Washington, D.C. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, will assist the party or parties so attacked. It was the first time Article 5 had been invoked by NATO since its founding. On September 12, 2001, NATO convened a special meeting in response to the attacks on American soil and afterward issued a statement saying, in part, that the United States could rely on the support and assistance of NATO if it was found that the attack was directed from abroad. The organization's Secretary-General, Lord Robertson, 1946, strongly condemned the attacks and called for the international community and the members of the alliance to unite their forces in fighting the scourge of terrorism. The invocation of Article 5 was confirmed by NATO on October 2, after U.S. Ambassador at Large Frank Taylor briefed the organization's chief decision-making body on the investigations into the terrorist attacks. The North Atlantic Council determined that the information provided by Taylor confirmed that the individuals who carried out the attacks belonged to the worldwide terrorist network of Al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden and protected by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. At a press conference held October 8, Secretary-General Lord Robertson announced NATO's full support for the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan. The following day it was confirmed that NATO assets had been deployed to the eastern Mediterranean to establish a presence in the region. But the alliance did not take a lead role in the military effort to oust the Taliban from Afghanistan.
What did Freud believe?
The Austrian neurologist believed that human behavior and all mental states are influenced by repressed and forgotten impressions, many of them from childhood. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, further believed that by uncovering these impressions, Collectively called a complex, he could effect a cure for his patient. Freud regarded infantile mental processes, including infantile sexuality, of particular importance to the unconscious, and therefore influential to human behavior. While he initially used hypnosis, a sleep-like state in which the patient is open to suggestion, as a method of revealing the unconscious, Freud later turned to a new form of treatment called free association. By this method, a patient talks about whatever is on his or her mind, jumping from one idea to the next. The memories and feelings that surface through free association are then analyzed by the therapist to find the root of the patient's mental or emotional problem. Freud also interpreted his patient's dreams, which he believed are unconscious representations of repressed desires. Free association and dream analysis are the cornerstones of psychoanalysis. In analyzing human behavior, Freud came to the conclusion that the mind, or psyche, is divided into three parts: the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID is the source of instincts, the ego is the mediator between those instincts and reality, and the superego is the conscience. The superego functions to reward or punish through a system of moral attitudes and a sense of guilt. The theories of psychoanalysis hold that if the parts of the mind oppose each other, a mental or emotional disorder, called a neurosis, occurs. Freud's theories revolutionized the fields of psychiatry and psychology. They also influenced methods and philosophies of child rearing and education. While psychoanalysis has been credited with helping millions of mentally ill patients, Freud's theories have also been rejected or challenged by many.
What advances were made in medicine during the Middle Ages?
During the Middle Ages, 500-1350, medicine became institutionalized. The first public hospitals were opened and the first formal medical schools were established, making healthcare, formerly administered only in the home, more widely available and improving the training of doctors. These developments had been brought on by necessity. Europe saw successive waves of epidemics during the Middle Ages. Outbreaks of leprosy began in the 500s and peaked in the 1200s, the Black Death. The bubonic plague killed about a quarter of the European population, and smallpox and other diseases afflicted hundreds of thousands of people. Consequently, many hospitals meant to serve the poor were established, as were the first medical schools, some of them associated with universities that were then forming, such as the University of Bologna, Italy, and the University of Paris, France. In 900 the first medical school was started in Salerno, Italy. European physicians during the period were greatly influenced by the works of Persian physician and philosopher Rhazes, or Reza, c. 865–c. 930. Considered the greatest doctor of the Islamic world. Rhazes's works accurately describing measles and smallpox were translated into Latin and became seminal references in the Christian world as well. Another prominent Islamic, the scientist Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, 980-1037, produced a philosophical scientific encyclopedia, which included the medical knowledge of the time. In the West, the work became known as Canon of Medicine, and with its descriptions of many diseases, including tetanus and meningitis, it remained influential in European medical education for the next 600 years.
How old is animal experimentation?
Scientific experimentation using animals including mice, rats, rabbits, guinea pigs, monkeys, and dogs dates back to ancient times. But the practice did not become widespread until the late 19th century. Clinical experimentation, which includes vivisection, surgery on live animals, has yielded benefits to human health. But because it often results in the suffering and death of the animals, many people are against the practice. Tens of millions of animals are used for experimentation in the United States today. Official estimates cite that mice and rats account for some 90% of this number. The practice remains controversial as people grapple with the issues surrounding animal rights and weigh these considerations against improved scientific understanding of illnesses.
Who was Balanchine?
The name of the Russian-born choreographer is synonymous with modern American ballet. George Balanchine, 1904–1983, was one of the most influential choreographers of the 20th century, creating more than 200 ballets in his lifetime and choreographing 19 Broadway musicals as well as 4 Hollywood films. He co-founded 3 of the country's foremost dance institutions: the School of American Ballet, in 1934, the American Ballet Company, 1935, and the New York City Ballet, 1948, the first American ballet company to become a public institution. His entrance into the world of dance was entirely accidental. In August 1914, Balanchine accompanied his sister to an audition at the Imperial School of Ballet and was invited to audition as well. Though his sister failed, he passed and, against his own wishes, was promptly enrolled. However, Balanchine remained uninterested in the art form, even running away from school shortly after starting. The turning point for the young dancer came with a performance of Tchaikovsky's ballet The Sleeping Beauty, 1890. He was dazzled by the experience and chose to stay with the school's rigorous training program. Serenade, 1935, music by Tchaikovsky, is considered by many to be Balanchine's signature work. His other well-known works include Apollo, 1928, The Prodigal Son, 1929, The Nutcracker, 1954, and Don Quixote, 1965, as well as Jewels, the first full-length ballet without a plot. Remembering the opportunity he had been given as a child, Balanchine was known for choreographing children's roles into many of his ballets. His outreach did not end there, he organized lecture demonstration tours for schools, gave free ballet performances for underprivileged children, conducted free annual seminars for dance teachers, and gave free advice and use of his ballets to other ballet companies. Balanchine's unparalleled body of work was instrumental in establishing the vibrant style and content of contemporary ballet in America, where he brought ballet to the forefront of the performing arts.
Who determines whether a law violates the liberties guaranteed by the Bill of Rights?
It is the job of the U.S. Supreme Court to decide whether or not a law impinges upon the liberties listed in or implied by the Bill of Rights, 1791. The difficult task before the Supreme Court justices is in determining what rights are implied. Such questions prompt months of hearings and deliberations before a decision can be reached as to the constitutionality of a contested law. The judicial body makes its determinations based on a majority vote of the 9 justices, 1 Chief Justice and 8 associates. Established as the highest court in the country by Article 3 of the Constitution, the court has ultimate authority in all legal questions that arise pertaining to the Constitution. Called the Court of Last Resorts, the Supreme Court both interprets the acts of Congress, including laws and treaties, and determines the constitutionality of federal and state laws, under the 14th Amendment. The court has upheld that most of the Bill of Rights also applies to state governments.
When did chain stores begin?
The innovation of the chain store, technically defined as 2 or more retail outlets operated by the same company and which sell the same kind of merchandise, was made by American businessman George Gilman, c. 1830 to 1901, and George Huntington Hartford, 1833 to 1917. Who in 1859 set up the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company in New York City. Better known as A&P, the stores proliferated rapidly, and other chain stores, such as W.P. Woolworth, established 1879, and J.C. Penney, 1902, opened their doors for business. The early 20th century saw tremendous growth of the chain stores. Between 1910 and 1931, the number of A&P stores grew from 200 to more than 15,000. While the department stores, also a byproduct of the late 1800s, catered to middle and upper-class customers, the chain stores, including Woolworth's Five and Dimes, which sold many items at such low price points, served lower-income consumers. Chain stores, which operate within all major retailing categories, including grocery stores, department stores, and drugstores, as well as apparel and food outlets, offer consumers many advantages. Their system of centralized and mass buying allow them to acquire merchandise from manufacturers and wholesalers at reduced costs. This savings is passed along to the consumer, who pays less for the item. Further, they experience economies of advertising. A single ad placement promotes all the stores within the chain. In the 1920s, independent retailers rallied against the chain stores, citing they had unfair advantages. This argument has resurfaced off and on throughout the 20th century. As chain stores entered into more and more retailing sectors, including hardware, jewelry, furniture, music, and books. But the only federal legislation that constructively attempted to regulate the chain stores came in 1936. The Robinson-Patman Act tried to control competition. Today, chain stores account for roughly 1/3 of all American retail sales.
How did Betty Friedan's feminine mystique launch the modern women's rights movement?
American author and activist Betty Friedan's 1921 landmark work was published in 1963. She argued that in the post-war era American society expected women only to be devoted housewives and mothers. This was the ideal, the mystique, that was both promoted and accepted. In the feminine mystique, Friedan challenged this prevailing notion, causing many women to re-examine their lives. After all, during World War II, 1939–45, women had ably stepped into the workplace to keep industry running as the men went to war. When the servicemen came back, women returned to the home and were not expected to seek careers.
How did the American tobacco industry get started?
Tobacco, a member of the nightshade family, is an indigenous American plant. When Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506, arrived in the West Indies in 1492, he found the native inhabitants smoking rolls of tobacco leaves, called tino. The word tobacco is derived from the Spanish tabaco, which is probably from tino. The practice of drinking smoke was observed to have a relaxing effect. Upon returning to Spain, Columbus took seeds of the plant with him. By 1531, tobacco was being cultivated on a commercial scale in the Spanish colonies of the West Indies. In 1565, English naval commander John Hawkins, 1532–1595, introduced tobacco to England, where smoking was condemned as a vile and stinking custom by King James I, 1566–1625, decades later. Tobacco was not commercially cultivated on the North American mainland until English colonist John Rolfe, 1585–1622, carried seeds from the West Indies to Jamestown, Virginia, where he settled in 1610. By 1612 he had successfully cultivated tobacco and discovered a method of curing the plant, making it a viable export item. Jamestown, Virginia, became a boomtown, and England's King James, who collected export duties, changed his mind about the habit of smoking. The coastal regions of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina were soon dominated by tobacco plantations, and the crop became the backbone of the economies in these colonies. Cultivation of tobacco did not require the same extent of land or slave labor as did other locally grown crops such as rice and indigo, but it depleted the nutrients of soil more rapidly, causing growers to expand their lands westward into the Piedmont region, the plain lying just east of the Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountains. In 1660, British Parliament passed the Second Navigation Act, declaring that tobacco and other articles from England's American colonies could only be exported to the British Isles. Tobacco prices dropped in response to the legislation, and the colonial economies were weakened, causing political discontent with the mother country. But European demand was not diminished, and the colonists soon resumed exports. Despite the Second Navigation Act, by 1765 colonial exports of tobacco were nearly double in value the exports of bread and flour. The crop helped define the plantation economy of the South, which prevailed until the outbreak of the American Civil War, 1861–65. During the 1800s, companies such as R.J. Reynolds Tobacco and American Tobacco were founded. Despite the highly publicized dangers of using tobacco, smoking or chewing, tobacco has remained an important crop, and the manufacture of tobacco products an important industry in the American South.
Why was Galileo tried for heresy by the Inquisition?
The trouble began for Galileo, 1564–1642, in 1613 when he published Letters on the Solar Spots, in which he advocated the Copernican system of the universe, which proposed that Earth, along with other galactic bodies, revolves around the Sun. This view ran contrary to the accepted beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church, whose doctrine was based on Ptolemy's theory that Earth was the center of the universe, and that all the planets, including the Sun, revolved around it. Thus, in 1616 the Pope issued a decree declaring the Copernican system to be false and erroneous, and Galileo was ordered not to support it. When a new pope, Urban VIII, was coronated in 1624, Galileo traveled to Rome to make an appeal that the edict against the Copernican theory be revoked. The Pope declined to do so, but he did give Galileo permission to write about the Copernican system, under the condition that he not give it preference over the church-sanctioned Ptolemaic model. So, in 1632, Galileo published again, Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. However, contained unconvincing objections to the Copernican view. The Church saw through it and summoned the author to Rome to stand before the Inquisition. Church interrogators. Galileo was accused of violating the original edict of 1616, put on trial for heresy, and found guilty. Though he was ordered to recant, at some point he uttered the famous statement, "And yet it moves," a reference to the Copernican theory that Earth rotates on its axis. Galileo was supposed to be imprisoned, but the Pope commuted the sentence to house arrest at Galileo's home near Florence, where he died blind at the age of 78.
How old is the Parthenon?
The ancient temple, originally built on the Acropolis, a hill overlooking the city of Athens, was constructed between 447 and 432 B.C. by Greeks. The white marble edifice, considered a prime example of Greek architecture, has an interesting history. About AD 500, it became a Christian church. In the mid-1400s, when the region was captured by Turkish Muslims, it was turned into a mosque. And in 1687, when Venetians tried to take the city, the Parthenon was severely damaged. Only ruins remain today.
How long have hurricanes been given names?
The practice of naming hurricanes has a long history. According to the National Hurricane Center, for hundreds of years Caribbean storms were named according to the saint whose liturgical day it was when the storm hit. This became confusing when hurricanes struck on the same day but in different years, leading to such references as Hurricane San Felipe II. During World War II, the U.S. military began naming storms, giving them women's names. In 1951 the American Weather Services began naming Atlantic Ocean storms according to a phonetic alphabet: Abel, Baker, Charlie, etc. Just a few years later forecasters returned to using women's names, and a new list of names was created for each Atlantic hurricane season, June 1 to November 30. Storms in some areas of the Pacific began being named in 1959, and by 1964, all regions of the Pacific were using the naming convention. For each year, there is a list for each region of the world where tropical cyclones occur: Atlantic, Eastern North Pacific, Central North Pacific, Western North Pacific, etc. The lists of names are agreed upon at international meetings of the World Meteorological Association. Establishing names for storms helps meteorologists track more than one storm at any given time, makes clear the communication of warnings, and facilitates study since the names of major hurricanes are retired to avoid confusion later. In 1979 equality was brought to the naming process, introducing men's names as well as multicultural names to each season's list. Since each season's storms are named in alphabetical order, there is a preponderance of storms beginning with the letters A, B, and C. However, in 1995, Hurricane Opal ravaged the Florida Panhandle. Not since forecasters began naming hurricanes had they reached the letter O. The letters Q, U, X, Y, and Z are not used because there are so few names beginning with those letters.
When was the Interstate Commerce Commission formed?
The Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, was established by Act of Congress in 1887. The agency is responsible for regulating the rates and services of specified carriers that transport freight, goods, whether raw or finished, and passengers between states. Its jurisdiction, expanded by subsequent acts of Congress, includes trucking, bus services, water carriers, expedited delivery services, and even oil pipelines. The regulatory agency, the nation's first such body, was born out of necessity in the late 1800s. As farmers in particular charged the railroads with discriminatory freight practices. With rail lines crisscrossing the nation, the question of who would control rates and monitor practices had become an increasingly difficult one to answer. Many states, particularly in the Midwest, set up their own regulatory boards. But because the rail companies operated between states, enforcing state laws on them proved cumbersome and impractical. Meanwhile, the railroads, operating without the purview of any effective regulatory body, set their own standards and practices, which resulted in many abuses. In an 1877 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, in the case of Munn v. Illinois, the authority of the state boards to regulate the railroads was upheld. But less than a decade later, in the case of Wabash, St. Louis and Pacific Railway Company v. Illinois, the High Court invalidated its earlier decision and proclaimed that only the U.S. Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. Citing Section 8 of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, 1790, which states that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And among the several states, and with the Indian tribes, the Interstate Commerce Act was passed in 1887. Setting up the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the interstate railroads. The agency's purview was later expanded to include all ground and water carriers that operate on an interstate basis. In addition to controlling rates, the agency also enforces laws against discrimination. The ICC's authority was strengthened by congressional legislation including the Hepburn Act, 1906, and the Mann-Elkins Act, 1910.
What were the Dutch colonial holdings?
New Netherlands was the only Dutch colony on the North American mainland. It consisted of land surrounding the Hudson River, in present-day New York, and, later, the lower Delaware River, in New Jersey and Delaware. Explorers from the Netherlands first settled the area in about 1610. In 1624 the colony of New Netherlands was officially founded by the Dutch West India Company. On behalf of the company, in 1626 Dutch colonial official Peter Minuit, 1580–1638, purchased the island of Manhattan from the American Indians for an estimated $24 in trinkets. The colonial capital of New Amsterdam, present-day New York City, was established there. The Dutch held the colony until 1664 when it was conquered by the English under the direction of the Duke of York. James II, 1633–1701, the king's brother. The English sought the territory since New Netherlands separated its American holdings. Under British control the area was divided into two colonies, New Jersey and New York. During the colonial period the Netherlands also claimed the West Indies islands of Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, called the Netherlands Antilles, which were administered separately from New Netherlands on the North American mainland.
What is Proust's claim to literary fame?
Marcel Proust, 1871–1922, is generally considered the greatest French novelist of the 20th century and is credited with introducing to fiction the elements of psychological analysis, innovative treatment of time, and multiple themes. Proust is primarily known for his multi-volume work Et la recherche du temps perdu, 1954, which was published in English as Remembrance of Things Past. Proust was an creative stylist as well as shrewd social observer. In the mid-1890s Proust joined other prominent artists, including the great French novelist of the 19th century, Émile Zola, 1840–1902, to form the protest group known as the Revisionists or Dreyfusards. The artists were staunch supporters of Alfred Dreyfus, 1859–1935. And therefore vocal critics of the French military, who they accused of anti-Semitism for keeping the French army officer wrongly accused of treason, imprisoned on Devil's Island.
When did Operation Iraqi Freedom begin?
The U.S.-led multinational military campaign in Iraq began on March 19, 2003, with airstrikes on the capital of Baghdad. Ground forces moved into southern Iraq from neighboring Kuwait. After taking the southern city of Basra, U.S. Marines and Army infantry moved northward toward the capital. U.S. troops took control of Baghdad on April 9, after which images of gleeful Iraqis dismantling statues and other symbols of Saddam Hussein's despotic rule flooded the American media. Coalition forces, American troops, and U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters then pressed into northern Iraq, including Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, and a loyalist stronghold. On April 14 Tikrit fell. The war seemed to be near conclusion. but the hard combat had only begun and continued for years, even after the end of major combat was declared.
Who was Hoyle?
Edmund Hoyle, 1671 or 1672 to 1769, was an English card player who, in 1742 at the age of 70, published short treatise on whist, which provided the rules for a game that developed into auction bridge and later into contract bridge. Hoyle's name has survived among bridge players in the phrase "according to Hoyle."
What is a hanging chad?
A hanging chad, also called a bulging chad or a pregnant chad, is the scored piece of paper that remains on a punch card ballot if the voter fails to fully punch the card to dislodge the paper. The chad gained national and international attention in the presidential election of 2000 when the race between Republican candidate George W. Bush, 1946, and Democrat Al Gore, 1948, hinged on the ballot count in Florida. The vote tally in the Sunshine State was so close that manual counting took place in the days following the November 7 election. News photos showed counters holding punch card ballots up to the light to try to determine if a voter had meant to poke a chad through, thereby indicating a vote. But Florida was not the first state where a disputed election came down to ballot inspection to try to determine voter intent. In 1996, a Democratic primary for a House seat in Massachusetts was settled by carefully inspecting ballots and counting those that were merely dimpled by the voter. In support of its decision to scrutinize ballots to determine voter intent, the Massachusetts Supreme Court stated, if the intent of the voter can be determined with reasonable certainty from an inspection of the ballot, effect must be given to that intent and the vote counted. The conclusion was that a voter should not be disqualified for failing to completely express his or her intent. A 1990 case in Illinois and a 1981 case in Indiana also ruled in favor of examining ballots to try to determine what the voter meant to do. In all cases, ballots where no clear intent could be determined were set aside. In 2000, the Florida recount ended with a tally of 2,909,176 votes for Bush and 2,907,451 for Gore. In winning Florida, the national electoral vote swung in Bush's favor. Though Gore won the popular vote with a national total of 51,003,894 votes to Bush's 50,459,211. Bush managed to carry the Electoral College.
How does the Great Flood of 1993 compare with other floods?
The flood, which occurred in the summer of 1993, was immense. So much of Iowa was underwater that a satellite image, monitoring moisture on the earth, made the flooded area look like it was the size of Lake Michigan or Lake Superior. The area that was underwater was roughly equivalent to twice the size of Massachusetts. Even so, the Great Flood resulted in a smaller water-covered area than did floods earlier in the century, in 1926 and 1973. Due to heavy rainfall during the spring and summer of 1993, the Mississippi River widened to as much as 7 miles at some points, and the Missouri River also overflowed its banks despite the levee system that had been put in place by the federal government earlier in the century. The flood took 50 lives, displaced 85,000 people from their homes, destroyed 8,000 homes, damaged the contents of another 20,000 homes, stranded 2,000 loaded barges, and resulted in just more than 400 counties being declared disaster areas. The property and crop losses totaled $15 billion.
What was Al Capone tried for?
Notorious American gangster Alphonse Scarface Al Capone, 1899 to 1947. Whose crime syndicate terrorized Chicago in the 1920s, was brought to trial for income tax evasion. After Chicago police had been unable to bring Capone to justice for his criminal activities, which included trafficking bootleg liquor, gambling, prostitution, and murder, the Federal Bureau of Investigation determined that the only way to prosecute the crime boss would be through violation of the tax laws. For 2.5 weeks in October 1931, the case against Capone was heard in a Chicago courtroom. He was found guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion, sentenced to 11 years in prison, and charged $50,000 in fines and $30,000 in court costs. While his first jail cell, in Illinois' Cook County Jail, allowed him the luxuries of a private shower, phone conversations, telegrams, and even visits by other gangsters, including Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz. Capone was eventually moved to Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, where he received no privileges. Released in 1939, Capone lived out his remaining years with his wife and son in Miami Beach, where he was reportedly haunted by imaginary killers.
Besides the native peoples, what discoveries did the Europeans make in the New World?
The new lands of the Western Hemisphere yielded many plants unknown in Europe. On Christopher Columbus's first voyage in 1492, he became the first European to discover maize, corn, sweet potatoes, capsicums, peppers, plantains, and pineapples. Subsequent expeditions found potatoes, wild rice, squash, tomatoes, cacao, chocolate beans, peanuts, cashews, and tobacco. These plants, many of which had been developed and cultivated by the American Indians, were carried back to Europe, and their cultivation spread to suitable climates throughout the world.
Why was the introduction of plastic important to industry?
Pioneered in the early 1900s, plastic, which is any synthetic organic material that can be molded under heat and pressure to retain a shape, affected every industry and every consumer. As a malleable material, plastic could quite literally be molded for countless uses, both for the production of goods and as a material in finished goods. In 1909, bakelite plastic was introduced, and over the next 3 decades the plastics industry grew, developing acrylic, nylon, polystyrene, and vinyl, polyvinyl chloride or PVC, in the 1930s, and polyesters in the 1940s. The applications seemed endless, from household items such as hosiery, clocks, radios, toys, flooring, food containers, bags, electric plugs, and garden hoses, to commercial uses such as automobile bodies and parts, airplane windows, boat hulls, packaging, and building materials. The space industry and medicine have also found critical uses for plastic products. Scientists have continued to find new applications for plastics in products such as compact discs, CDs, computer diskettes, outdoor furniture, and personal computers, PCs. The material has become essential to modern life.
Has the flu reached epidemic proportions?
Yes, influenza, also called the grippe, a contagious virus, has reached worldwide epidemic proportions 3 times in the 20th century alone. An epidemic occurred in 1918 and lasted into the next year. 20 million people died across the globe, including 500,000 Americans. Many of these deaths occurred as a result of secondary infections in patients whose immune systems were weakened by the flu. The advent of antibiotics, which became commercially available in 1945, helped prevent any subsequent flu outbreak from becoming so deadly. From 1957 to 1958, the Asian flu caused a worldwide epidemic. And from 1968 to 1969, the Hong Kong flu spread quickly to cause an epidemic. But dramatically fewer deaths were caused in these years due to the availability of antibiotics to control secondary infections.
Why is the Divine Comedy widely studied?
Simply put, the Divine Comedy, which consists of 100 cantos arranged in 3 books, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, is studied not only for the beauty of its verse, but for its timeless message. In a letter to his benefactor, Dante Alighieri, 1265–1321, explained that by writing the Divine Comedy, Divina Commedia, begun c. 1308, he would attempt to remove those living in this life from the state of misery and lead them to the state of felicity. While the subject of the poem, according to Dante, is the state of souls after death, allegorically, the poem is about humankind, who can exercise free will to bring rewarding or punishing justice upon themselves. Dante's masterpiece is considered the seminal work of Italian literature. At the time that he wrote the Divine Comedy, Latin was the undisputed language of science and literature. Italian, on the other hand, was considered vulgar. By skillfully writing this poem in the vernacular, Tuscan Italian, rather than Latin, Dante parted from tradition, marking a critical development for vernacular writing. In its translations, the Divine Comedy has become a point of reference for writers in any language. Scholars and students agree that Dante expresses universal truths in this work, which is also a finely crafted piece of literature.
Is Stravinsky the 20th century's foremost composer?
The Russian-born American composer Igor Stravinsky, 1882–1971, is certainly one of the greatest composers of the 20th century. Stravinsky wrote concerts, chamber music, piano pieces, and operas, as well as ballets, for which he may be most well known. Between 1903 and 1906, Stravinsky studied under the great Russian composer Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, 1844–1908. In 1908, Stravinsky wrote his first work of note, the orchestral fantasy Fireworks, which was in honor of the marriage of Rimsky-Korsakov's daughter. The piece caught the attention of Sergei Diaghilev, 1872–1929, of the Ballets Russes, who invited the young composer to participate in the ballet company's 1910 season. Ballets Russes had dazzled audiences the year before, bringing new energy to the art form. In collaboration with Diaghilev, Stravinsky went on to create masterpieces The Firebird, 1910, Petrushka, 1911, and Rite of Spring, 1913, among them. The partnership served to elevate the role of the ballet composer in the art world. Rite of Spring is either Stravinsky's most famous or most infamous work. It was first performed by the Ballets Russes in the third week of its 1913 season. The choreography was arranged by the famous dancer Vaslav Nijinsky, 1890–1950. But the performance stunned both the music and dance worlds. So extreme was the audience's reaction to this premiere work that a riot nearly broke out inside the theater. Stravinsky had composed his music not to express spring's idyllic qualities but rather its turmoil and dissonance similar to childbirth. Nijinsky paired Stravinsky's composition with complicated and visually frenzied dance movements, later characterized by the composer as a jumping competition. though many thought it a disastrous performance, when the ballets russes continued to London. Rite of Spring was more widely accepted there largely because the audience had been duly prepared for it. The following year, Rite of Spring was performed in concert in Russia, but the reaction was mixed. The young composer Sergei Prokofiev, 1891–1953, was in the audience and later wrote that he had been so moved by the work that he could not recover from the effects. Listeners today are still moved by the elevated rhythm of Rite of Spring, which makes an entire orchestra into a kind of sustained percussion instrument. Ultimately, most musicians and critics came to regard the watershed work as one of the finest compositions of the 20th century.
What happened to Athens after the Peloponnesian War?
At the same time that Athens was under attack from Sparta, the city-state also suffered a terrible plague, beginning in 430 B. C. The plague killed about a third of Athens' citizens. This contributed to Athens' eventual defeat at the hands of its Spartan rivals during the Peloponnesian War. After the plague had claimed so many lives, Athens simply couldn't muster the military leadership and strength that it needed to defeat the increasingly powerful Peloponnesian League. At the end of the fighting, in 404 BC, Athens was in ruins. Sparta became the dominant city-state in the Greek world. But conflicts continued among the city-states, and Thebes eventually defeated Sparta in 371 BC. As a result of the ongoing warfare, the Greek economic conditions declined, and the gap between rich and poor widened. The public spirit that had been the hallmark of the golden age of Greece disappeared. In short, the city-states were no longer the glorious entities they had once been. While the Greek city-states were in decline, Greece's neighbor to the north, Macedonia, was growing more powerful. In 353 BC, Macedonian King Philip II, 382–336 BC, launched an attack on Greece. The war that resulted did not end until 338 BC, when Greece was finally conquered. The Macedonian victory was only the first part of Philip's plans. He believed a combined Macedonian-Greek army could defeat the powerful Persians. But he was not to see this happen. When Philip was killed by a Macedonian in 336 BC, he was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander, 356–323 BC, a man history would come to call the Great. Alexander carried out his father's plan to invade Persia. And 2 years after Philip's death, Alexander began a 10-year campaign that ultimately conquered the Persian Empire. By the time he was 30 years old, Alexander had conquered much of the known world, expanding his empire from Egypt to India.
Who were the Khmer Rouge?
The Khmer Rouge, or Red Khmer, were a group of Cambodian communists led by radical Marxist leader Pol Pot, 1925 to 1998. Between 1970 and 1975, the Khmer Rouge guerrilla force, supported by communists from neighboring Vietnam, waged a war to topple the U.S. supported government of Lon Nol, 1913 to 1985. On April 16, 1975, Lon Nol's regime fell. And the next day the Khmer Rouge seized the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. The ruthless revolutionary leader Pol Pot became prime minister of a communist Cambodia and instituted a reign of terror. In his attempt to turn Cambodia into an agriculture-based society, the Khmer Rouge systematically emptied the cities, forcibly moving the people onto collective farms where they performed hard labor. Anyone thought to be opposed to the Khmer Rouge was killed. An estimated 2 million people died by execution, overwork, and starvation. Pol Pot's experiment had failed, and his efforts to revolutionize Cambodia amounted to nothing short of genocide. A Vietnamese invasion ousted the Khmer Rouge in 1979 and installed a new leadership. But civil wars were fought throughout the 1980s. The warring factions, who had made various alliances among themselves, finally signed a peace treaty in 1991, under the watchful eye of the United Nations. Elections were held in 1993. The resulting constitution provided for a democratic government with a limited monarchy. At that point, the Cambodian leadership seemed to come full circle with Norodom Sihanouk. 1922, being crowned king in 1993, in 1970 Sihanouk had been deposed by Lon Nol, whose regime later became the target of the Khmer Rouge. During his lifetime Sihanouk made strides in establishing Cambodia's independence, and he enjoyed great public support. Due to failing health, he abdicated the throne in November 2004 and was succeeded by his son, Norodom Sihanouk, 1953. 4 decades after Pol Pot was deposed, he continued to lead a revolutionary force of the Khmer in Cambodia, though he remained out of public view. His own men turned against him in early 1998, and Pol Pot died in April of that year. In December, the last main fighting force of the Khmer Rouge surrendered to the Cambodian government. The event was broadcast on national television. Though some Khmer leaders remained in hiding and small bands of guerrilla fighters were thought to still exist, the radical Marxist group, which had terrorized Cambodia, no longer presented a threat to the government.